Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with John Marenbon about free will and foreknowledge in Boethius' most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce John Marenbon, a senior research fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge. John has written extensively on Western philosophy in the period of time that he calls the Long Middle Ages, roughly the years 200 to 1700. He's the author of several texts introducing this period, including the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on medieval philosophy, as well as a book titled Medieval Philosophy, A Very Short Introduction, published by Oxford University Press in 2015. But John has also written specifically on the figure of Boethius, who we're going to talk about today, including the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on him, and a book titled Boethius, published in 2003 by Oxford University Press in their Great Medieval Thinkers series. So as I said, our focus today will be on Boethius, especially on his book, The Consolation of Philosophy. Well, welcome to the show, John. Thanks for joining us. Could you tell us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Well, yes, I've been working on medieval philosophy for ages and ages and ages, about 50 years. It's quite a complicated story how I came to medieval philosophy, where it's not something which is really studied in Cambridge, hardly studied in the UK, indeed. And probably not worth telling in detail. How do I come to talk about free will, though? I suppose it's a function of what I think almost the whole of medieval philosophy in the broad Western tradition. It does tend to be an absolutely central topic. You know, people who can't get away from it. This is perhaps particularly true of two figures, probably the two figures I've written most about, who are Boethius that we're talking about today, and then another one is Abelard, and Abelard was also very interested in this problem. But then you go to all sorts of other people. Think of Avicenna, think of Aquinas, think of Scotus. So it's. I think perhaps it's particularly important if you're looking at medieval philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Longtime listeners of this podcast will know that we've mentioned Boethius before. And we even talked to Catherine Rogers about a view in the debate on freedom of foreknowledge that's named after Boethius. But today we'll focus on Boethius and his views. Could you start by giving us a bit of historical context for him? When did he live? Who are some of his influences? And what are some of his most widely read texts, or any other background that you think might be helpful?
Thank you very much. Yes, it's a pleasure to do so. So, well, we are now celebrating, if that's the right word, commemorating the 1500th anniversary of Boethius' death. Though we can't be quite sure whether it was 525 or 526 or 524. And the most famous thing about Boethius is probably his death, which is something which looking into it forms the subject of his most widely read work, and the work we'll be talking about most today, The Consolation of Philosophy. But so let's turn the pages back. He was born in 476, and 476 is also the date of the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, who was called Romulus Augustulus. And after him there was rule firstly by Odoacer, who was a Goth, and then by another set of Goths under the leadership of Theodoric, who was sort of highly educated and been educated in Constantinople. Boethius came from the very highest Roman senatorial class, a very grand Roman family. But he lived his life under the rule of the Goths, who mostly pursued a policy of allowing Romans like him to get on with their own lives, to indeed have their senatorial ceremonies, which didn't really mean anything. And so for many years, Boethius had a lot of leisure, and he also had an extraordinarily good education for the time. So not only did he have a high training in Latin, rhetoric and writing poetry and so on, as one sees in his work, but he also learned Greek fluently. And because of his resources, because he had lots of contacts in Constantinople, he had lots of access to Greek texts. So he's somebody working in Rome, but fully open to the Greek environment, to which is dominated at these times by the Platonic schools, Alexandria. So he has a very good philosophical education. However, also Boethius is living in a time when, well, everybody really in Italy is a Christian, and the upper classes of Rome, which a century before, so in Augustine's time, had been the last outposts of pagan resistance, had all become Christian. So there's really no possibility of being anything but a Christian for Boethius. So he has many years of what you might call learned leisure, and he starts off by writing works on the liberal arts, especially the mathematical ones. He's very interested in arithmetic and music, and he probably also wrote on astronomy and geometry. But he also sets out on, well, what he announces, and it's probably more than he ever really thought he would do. It would be an extraordinarily big project to translate and comment on all the works of Plato and Aristotle. And of course, had he done that, I think the whole history of philosophy would have been very different. In fact, what he managed to do was to translate almost all of Aristotle's logic and to provide commentaries on some of that. And that's very important. The commentaries are not, if you like, original works, but none of these commentaries were. They're always sort of taking things from past authors. But this doesn't mean that he didn't have original ideas in them and his own approach. And I mean, it's therefore particularly important when we come to think about his discussion of free will in the Consolation, to know that he commented on Aristotle's On Interpretation, chapter 9 of that, and to develop views on these problems were already there. So that was one of the things that he did. And then there's also a more theological side to him. There are 5 so-called opus philosacras, little short theological treatises. And of these, one of them is an entirely philosophical work about, if you like, the relationship between God and the goodness of all things. But there's nothing specifically Christian in it. But the others are all specifically Christian. In particular, 2 are about the Trinity, and one is about the person and nature in Christ, and one of them is a confession of faith. And I think what people would say about the work on the Trinity and the work on person and nature is that here Boethius is very much being a philosopher, taking ideas especially from Aristotle, but using them to discuss or clarify points of Christian doctrine. Now, his life changes in its last 4 or 5 years because, first of all, he's asked by Theodoric, so asked by the ruler to be his master of officers, something like the prime minister. So he was obviously looking for an important, well thought of, noble Roman to do this. But for various reasons, I think partly because Boethius is very idealistic in the way in which he deals with the court intrigue, partly because there were various political reasons why Theodoric would become suspicious of the Roman upper classes like Boethius. He quickly falls out of favor. He's falsely accused of treason and some other things, magic indeed, and he's sentenced to death. And that sentence is carried out, though there are some months or perhaps more than that between the sentence and the execution itself. And it's during that period that he writes his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy. And so in The Consolation of Philosophy, we need to distinguish between Boethius, the author, and the figure of Boethius, because Boethius sets the Consolation of Philosophy around his own position as someone who's fallen from a position of great power and is in prison waiting execution. So you have this figure, I refer to him as the prisoner. And he starts off in the depths of despair, and there appears to him the figure of philosophy. And philosophia, is clearly an attempt to personify the ancient tradition of philosophy. So it's important to stress that she's a pagan figure.
Mm.
And one of the remarkable things about the Consolation of Philosophy as well is there's nothing in it which is explicitly Christian. There may be echoes of Christian language, but there's no reference which is such. You say, this shows that the author is Christian. Though of course we know that he was, and it's worth thinking about what his choice to write it in that way implies. And anyway, the task of philosophy is to console, is to show Boethius that his complaint that God is not interested in human destinies, that the wicked flourish while the good are oppressed, is not justified. Despite his terrible change of circumstances, he's nothing to complain about. Things really are absolutely fine. We won't go into how philosophy does that, because by the time we come to the part we're interested in, philosophy has succeeded. And it's at that stage, in the last part, the last 2/3 of the final book, that Boethius, the prisoner, brings up a problem about God's foreknowledge and freedom, and that occupies the rest of the work. So that I think is the setting for Boethius' discussion.
That's really helpful and a great introduction to the work Consolation of Philosophy. I was going to ask, as we start talking more about this book in particular, Consolation of Philosophy, you already mentioned Boethius writes himself as a participant in a conversation with Lady Philosophy in the work. Is there anything else about the form that this book takes that you'd like to highlight before we jump into the content? And are there any key ideas you want to flag before we dive in deeper?
Well, yes, I mean, I would like to that. So as I've implied already, it's a dialogue. But more than that, it's a work written in prose and verse. The sections that philosophers concentrate on are the prose sections, but the verse sections also introduce important ideas. Now, partly these verse sections are a chance for Boethius, the author, to show off. So he writes all sorts of different types of classical meter. But there's something else which follows from this, because people in the ancient world were very conscious of the genre to which works belong. And works in verse and prose fall under the genre of Menippean satire. And Menippean satires set up certain sort of expectations in their audience. Because, I mean, one of the famous authors of Menippean satires is for instance, Lucian. They're works which are not completely serious. Doesn't mean they can't say serious things, but there's an element of questioning authority, doubting it, even mocking it. Now, it has to be said the standard view is to say that although the Consolation falls into the genre of Menippean satire, it forms an exception to it because it's an entirely serious work. After all, here is a man about to be executed who's discussing the highest good and freedom of the will and so on, and that doesn't sound light-hearted. Or still, you can take the view that being Menippean satire, his audience would wonder, well, do we take all that's being said authoritatively completely at face level, completely seriously? So that's just there as a possibility for interpretation.
Yeah. Well, how does the Lady Philosophy talk about God's relationship with the world? And does this evolve over the course of Consolation of Philosophy?
And philosophy says that she's adopting the manner of a doctor. She considers that Boethius is somebody who's ill, we'd call it mental illness, as a result of the terrible events that have happened to him. Like a good doctor, she'll start off by prescribing gentle remedies and then go on to more serious ones. So what she at the beginning, what she's trying to do is, if you like, to exculpate God from the accusation of not caring about the world by focusing on fortune and the way that a lot of the goods that people tend to value, that they think are goods, power, wealth, honor, all these things, are mere matters of fortune. They come and they go. That's their very nature. But also that they're not really valuable in themselves at all. So we shouldn't blame God when we lose them. Philosophy then moves on to what I call a monolithic conception of the good, in which the good is identical with God, and being happy is a matter in some way of grasping this highest good, which is God. And nothing else matters. And because the implication is you can grasp this highest good, you're not at all, you lose nothing of any value if, like Boethius, from being the most powerful man in the country, you'll turn to being a prisoner condemned to death. So there's a different way of presenting man's relation to God. Very little is said about what the steps one should take to grasp this highest good. Then, moving on to book 4, again we have a slight difference in the way in which the relationship with God is presented, because on the one hand, and along the lines already developed, we have the idea that it's not true that the wicked prosper and the good are oppressed, because virtue is its own reward, and virtue is the only valuable thing. And so, although the wicked think they're powerful, because they lack goodness and they're not virtuous, actually they're not powerful at all. Whereas on the contrary, so long as somebody remains virtuous, then nothing can be done to them. But philosophy's exposition of this is interrupted by Boethius the prisoner, who points out that this is wildly counterintuitive, and that surely it's preferable for him to have been in his former state than in the state in which he is now. And at that stage, philosophy takes a different tack and says, well, there's a providence. Everything is ruled by divine providence, and there's a purpose for everything, although we don't understand it. And so, if a good man is suffering, that perhaps is because he's being tested or he's being made better, but there's some purpose for this all. So that's a different sort of explanation. You could also see it as a contrast between thinking of God just as a final cause, which is often what he does. We should all move towards God as the object of our love, and thinking of God as an efficient cause, very much so interfering in the running of the world. So I think those are the changes we've had up until we had the discussion about free will and foreknowledge, and then and perhaps that I don't think it doesn't present so much a view of God and God's relation to the world which contradicts anything that goes before, but it
Right.
Focusing on different aspects of the relationship.
Yeah, that's an interesting shift that happens too. Well, you've already alluded to this, but towards the end of Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius and philosophy start talking about the issue of free will and also divine omniscience, in particular, God's knowing what we're going to do in advance. So you say Boethius seems to think that we can't have free will if our wills are causally determined. And given that, it seems like God's being omniscient is an apparent threat to our having free will. Could you explain how Boethius presents the problem of human free will and divine foreknowledge?
Yes. So I think, talk about Boethius talking about our wills being causally determined. I don't think that I don't think he puts the causal argument the forefront. So
yeah,
what happens is that the Boethius the prisoner says to philosophy, there's this terrible problem, which is that, and I'm rather than try reading out the exact words, let me say what I think the point of them is. I think the point here is this: we like to we think we hold the future is open, and unless the future is open, unless it can be the case that one thing will happen or another thing will happen, and to some extent that's up to us, then there are the most terrible consequences, because he thinks that the whole foundation of morality will be destroyed. And he also thinks that another thing which might surprise us now, but he puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that we will no longer be able to pray, or it won't make any sense to pray to God. And prayer, asking God for things, is the one way in which humans and gods can have some sort of interchange. But of course, the idea is if the future's fixed, then it's pointless to pray to God because it's already set what's going to happen. So, on the one hand, the future can't be fixed. But we want to say, he's absolutely clear, we want to say that God knows all things. And this means all particular events. He certainly wouldn't be content with God just knowing universal. So God knows all things. God knows everything that not just that has happened and is happening, but everything that will happen. So God has knowledge of what's going to happen in the future. But there seems to be an incompatibility here. And the incompatibility, it's important to stress, is it's not between God happening to always get it right about the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's the fact that God knows the future.
Yeah.
And yet the future is open, so it just doesn't seem to be something that God can know. And so you seem to be left with either saying God doesn't know the future, and that's actually there's a possibility which he won't consider.
Mm-hmm.
That would be as a blasphemy. But then you seem to be left with the position the future is not open. There are no alternative possibilities. The future is fixed. That's how it has to be in order to be an object for God's knowledge. And I said I didn't think that this was a matter of causality, because the structure of this is that Boethius, the prisoner, presents the problem, and then gives an attempt to solve it himself. And one of these attempts is to say, well, if when we say that God foreknows what's going to happen, that's not a causal relationship between God and what's going to happen. It's merely that he knows it.
Mm-hmm.
And then an argument to escape seems to be, well, because it's not a causal connection, it's not really important. The future is not causally determined, so we can relax. But Boethius, the prisoner, goes against that argument and says, well, all right, I agree, there's no causal determination, but the point is that if God knows it, it must be the case. So it doesn't matter about causality. But there is a bit of a twist to that, which I should mention, that in spite of doing that, Boethius, the prisoner, also mentions in an aside, which he then doesn't take up, but is alluded to again right at the end of the work. But he mentions something which he and other Christians, indeed other Platonists, would have thought, which is that in a sense God's knowledge is causal in a way that our knowledge isn't. Because normally, if I succeed in knowing that there's nobody else in the room now with me, one of the things that makes that knowledge, not the only thing, is that it's the case that I'm the only person in the room.
Mm.
For me to have knowledge, it depends on my getting things right, what I'm proposing, what I'm holding, being the way things are. But for God, it's the other way around. It's because God knows something. So it's because God knows there's only one person in this room now, that there's only one person in this room now. God never owes his knowledge to anything else, in the way that Boethius puts it. So, in a strange way, although Boethius makes the distinction and says that we're not dealing with a causal relationship, he also, in this aside, says, yes, but of course, God's knowledge is not like ours, and it does actually bring about what is known.
Yeah. Well, philosophy provides an answer to the challenge, and it's one that's still of interest today in philosophy of religion. But there's different views about what exactly this answer is. So could you start by explaining the reading of this part of the text according to which philosophy is arguing that God is atemporal or outside of time?
Yes, indeed. So after Boethius, the prisoner has had his own attempt at answering his own problem, philosophy takes over. And one of the things that philosophy does, not actually immediately, is to consider the nature of God, and especially God's relationship to time. And philosophy says that God is eternal, and you shouldn't think of eternity simply as not having a beginning or not having an end in time. God's eternity is not at all like that. God's eternity is a matter of a sort of simultaneous possession of unending life. So it's somehow God seems to exist in something which is much nearer to a point than anything else, although it's a point which in some way has duration, but not duration of the type that the time has. God lives his life, which is an intellectual life, all in one, and that's the nature of divine eternity. And then I suppose the simple way of applying that as a solution to the problem is to say, since God isn't in time, you can't talk about divine foreknowledge at all. So God just knows what is happening simultaneously, as people sometimes say, with him. And if there's no foreknowledge, then there isn't a problem, because we don't think it's problematic that somebody should know what we're doing now. You don't think that because you're watching a chariot race, and this is the weakest example, the charioteers don't have control over their chariots. So, but God is like that. God's position with regard to past, present, and future is like that. So and so you say, because God is outside time, there isn't a problem of foreknowledge. People can often do it a bit more rigorously, and let me try to explain this. But it's often difficult without a blackboard or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's the way that some people read the prisoner's presentation of the problem. I think it's a misreading, but it might be justified, is to say that what he does is illegitimately to move from the truth that necessarily, so broad scope necessarily, if God knows P, then P, and from that to conclude necessarily P, which is wrong. I mean, you can't conclude that because there's that broad scope necessity, or what people in the Middle Ages called the necessity of the consequentia, the necessity of the whole if-then proposition. But there's the narrow scope necessity, or what they call the necessity of the consequent.
Yeah.
However, you can make an argument which supplies an initial premise and then does get you from, so necessarily, if God knows P, which is some future proposition, then P to necessarily P. And that's by saying that God knows P is itself necessary, and by having a transfer of necessity principle. And most logicians will agree that then you get to necessarily P.
Yeah.
Now, not only does Boethius himself not put forward that argument, but I would hold that he couldn't have done. He just didn't have that understanding of propositionality to enable him to do so. Though I do think that sort of stronger argument, a more formal argument, but I know was developed in the 13th century and is regularly discussed in 13th century texts. And one then considers, well, how can the idea about God's being outside time be used against that argument? Well, how is it that, why do they get to God knows that God knows P? How do they say that that's necessary, which is what you need to do in order to invoke the transfer of necessity principle and get to your conclusion? They did it by saying it's not just that God today knows what I'm going to do in the future. God knew that yesterday. Indeed, He's known it for all eternity. So it's something about the past. And the past has a certain sort of necessity. It's often called accidental necessity.
Mm.
And that's why the argument is sometimes called the accidental necessity argument. Now, if God is outside time, then nothing in God's thought, God's knowing things, is an event in the past. So you say you can't use that sophisticated argument because it depends on God's knowledge being an event in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the problem with that is that there are reasons besides its pastness that one might want to say that God's knowledge is necessary. Many people would do. And the second thing is that just as there's an accidental necessity of the past, so you could say there's an accidental necessity of the eternal present. I mean,
Yeah.
if you want to say the past is necessary, then if there's some being existing in an eternal present, and that it seems as though that's going to be necessary too. So, actually, I don't think that goes very far. And I also think that once you got into that, and I've given this because you asked me about these interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
He moved really a long way away from Boethius himself.
Yeah.
He was very much into the business of exploring the Boethian interpretation and the arguments against it. Because I say that you don't find that argument in Boethius.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, you read this part of Consolation of Philosophy somewhat differently, where the answer to the problem that the prisoner Boethius raises is not about God's timelessness, but about ways of knowing and about how these relate to the sort of necessity of the things known. Could you say a bit more about how you understand this part of the text?
Yes, indeed. So, as I said, the discussion about God's eternity doesn't immediately follow when philosophy starts her discussion. On the contrary, what she immediately does is to criticize what might seem to be a point that one should take for granted, which is that if your cognition of something is not as the thing is, then you're erring. You've been led astray. And
Mm-hmm.
we might say, well, yeah, that's obvious, but philosophy won't have that because she says no. What you're doing wrong then is to think that one has to make these judgments on the basis of the thing known or thing cognized. Rather, we should be thinking about the way in which it's cognized, and different cognizers cognize things in different ways. The end point to which this will be working is to say that God is able to know, is able to grasp future events as necessary. And he doesn't say that they're not. He said they are necessary from God's point of view, from the point of view of God knowing them, although in themselves they're not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a contradiction, but it does involve a relativization of what is cognized to the cognizer. And that's a sort of type of relativization that Boethius thinks that we should make.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to justify that, on the one hand, he talks about the way in which different levels of cognizer below God know what you might say is the same object. He contrasts the way in which things are known by the senses, touch and then sight, with the way in which they can be grasped intellectually as universals. And grasping things intellectually as universals is the highest sort of cognition that human beings have. But he then says, well, imagine what it would be like for there to be a type of cognition which stands to our intellectual cognition as our intellectual cognition stands to our sensible cognition. Now, there you're getting close to the way in which God knows things. So this is partly trying to say that there are different ways in which things are grasped, and they're going to be grasped differently by those different ways. And it's in this context, and if you like to make this to make this context clear and to explain it in the case of God, that God and his timelessness is introduced. One of the things that that can help us to understand God's special way of cognition is to know that God cognizes everything in eternity. And by thinking about what it might be like to cognize from a position of God's eternity, which is not in time, but where all time is displayed to him, where he can see all the time. If you try to think on that model, what's involved in God knowing something which is future to us, you can get an idea of how, on the basis of God's mode of cognition, what is happening is indeed necessary, and so this can count as knowledge, but how in itself it's not. It's not fixed, and it's open. So in the end, it's not. I mean, I think a lot of people say, "Oh, what Boethius shows is that there really are future contingents, although we mightn't think so." But he only shows that in a relative sort of way, and that's to say, relative to God. And he would say that God's way of knowing is the supreme way of knowing. There are no future contingents, because everything in the future is indeed necessary. But relative to us, and also he says regarded in themselves, these future events are not necessary.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking about various elements of Boethius's most famous work, Consolation of Philosophy, but the form and content of this book introduced several interpretive difficulties. Could you describe some of the lingering questions about how we're supposed to interpret this text?
Yes. So I think that its readers would very much have noticed that here is a text in which the human protagonist is Christian and they're Christian readers, but this authority figure is a pagan.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, pagan perhaps has a long association, but it's part of the tradition of non-Christian, of ancient philosophy.
Right.
Yeah.
And that would raise a few queries about her authoritative status. I don't want to go too far. So there's an interpretation that's been put forward by Joel Relihan in a book called The Prisoner's Philosophy, where he suggests that this it's not just a certain sort of skepticism of certain questions. It would be a complete rejection that Boethius was writing in order that his audience should understand the inadequacy of philosophy. It's a philosophy's failure to console, and so you should turn to religion. And I mean, I don't think that is convincing at all, because it reduces the arguments which Boethius is taking so much trouble to develop into mere rhetoric. And also, Boethius was dedicated to philosophy. He had a very, very high opinion of philosophy. However, I think one could say that he at least wants to suggest that there isn't a completely satisfactory final philosophical solution to it. So not that philosophy is wrong, but that she doesn't know absolutely everything. Philosophy is not like God. And there are indeed passages where philosophy herself says, or she says, "I am not a god." Philosophy herself realizes her limitations, which might be his. As I said, you can imagine him as a great enthusiast for ancient philosophy, wanting to say, look, even the ancient philosophical tradition realized that it had limits. It can do a lot, but it can't do everything.
Right.
And of a piece with this, I see the leaving of certain ends untied in the book. So the way in which we never get told, we get told about this monolithic idea of the good, but we never get told how to attain it. The abrupt change from talking about human conduct in terms of virtue being its own reward to talking about it in terms of everything has been worked out providentially. So virtue doesn't have to be its own reward. In that way, you will be rewarded in a more obvious way. And as regards the bit that we've been looking at most closely, the tension there has to do with something which I mentioned before, which is Boethius' prisoners mention in passing of the fact that God's knowledge is causal, as well as just being gained from what the things are. And if that's the case, then that raises all sorts of problems which are not solved by Boethius' solution. So Boethius' solution as put forward by philosophy. Because philosophy is concentrating very, very much on the question of knowledge. How is it that we can reconcile God to knowing these things with their being open? And the answer I suggest is, well, they're relatively open. They're not completely open. But if it's actually God who is deciding on them rather than just knowing them as we do, then there are lots of problems that aren't solved. Now, towards the very end of the work, philosophy does make a gesture towards a sentence which suggests that the solution that she's put forward also solves this other problem which had been raised. But it's really very hard to see how it does so adequately. I say it's a mere gesture. Mm-hmm. So again, I think Boethius wants to say, look, we can use the nature of God to give a good solution to this problem, and this is a problem recognized in ancient philosophy, but it doesn't solve the whole problem about God and his relations to us, with regard to our final destiny and our freedom. And perhaps it's important that he says that, because he clearly doesn't want to get on to discussing theological matters. Because he wrote the theological treatises, he thought himself competent to do that. Perhaps only competent within a certain sort of framework of certain particular questions. So I think it's not. There's a whole theology of grace, which he knows about, right, but chooses not to mention. And I think he wants to say that solving the philosophical problems doesn't solve all the problems. There are other sort of problems and points which are there, and that's for a different sort of doctrine, which I'm not going to go into. So I neither want him to be rejecting philosophy because of Christianity, which he clearly isn't doing, but I want him very much to be saying that philosophy has its part, but there is also Christianity. So I'm making him actually a bit more, because I think mentioning to you before we started that I'd spent the day partly teaching Boethius, and partly teaching Boethius of Dacia. And in some ways I'm making Boethius a bit more like Boethius of Dacia, most people think, because Boethius of Dacia was an arts master who tried to combine being Christian with being a fervent Aristotelian by in his case, I think a relativization of Aristotelianism.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us, John. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Well, you mentioned obvious places such as my Stanford Encyclopedia article on medieval philosophy. I mean, I just say this because it's something I've done recently. If anyone is interested in seeing a rather unusual view of Aquinas, who's somebody I've tended to avoid writing about because I don't like the way in which he dominates medieval philosophy. There is it's a forthcoming edition of New Blackfriars, an article by me on Aquinas and philosophy as a way of life. I advertise this because the article, for what reason I don't know, but is on gold and open access, so that actually you can just put in my name and Aquinas and philosophy as a way of life and see this article. So if you're interested in something a bit strange, it's a long way from Boethius, then you might like to look at that.
All right.
That's great. And Aquinas and some of the other philosophers that you mentioned and theologians like Avicenna and Scotus, we're going to dedicate whole episodes to them in the coming weeks. So listeners can stay tuned for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks again, John.
Not at all. Thank you for asking me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In our next episode, we'll talk with John McGinnis about Avicenna.